A 60-year-old black woman was bullied by a privileged white boy, shoved and humiliated in the hallways of a prestigious school. But when the arrogant bully thought he had won, he had no idea that his cruel actions would come back to haunt him. Days later, the old woman, whose quiet strength had always gone unnoticed, would turn the tables, leaving him to face the consequences of his disrespect. What happened next would shake him to his core, and for the first time, he would learn the true power of dignity, justice, and regret. The hallway of Redwood Preparatory School was abuzz with the sounds of teenagers chatting and laughing, the chatter of the privileged students echoing off the marble floors. It was early afternoon, and Mabel Robinson, a 60-year-old black woman, was quietly scrubbing the hallway floor. Her uniform was worn and faded, the hem of her pants slightly frayed, a reflection of the years she had spent in this school, tirelessly cleaning the halls while the children and staff walked by, often unnoticed. Her hands, calloused and tired from years of hard work, moved methodically over the floor, each stroke done with dedication and precision. Mabel had always believed that her work, no matter how unnoticed, held value. This school might be filled with students who had wealth and opportunities, but Mabel held pride in the quiet dignity of her job. The janitor's closet, the broom, the mop, all of it felt like the small corner of the world where she could make a difference. The floor she scrubbed today was the same floor that had witnessed the laughter, the arguments, and the privileged strolls of students like Thomas Crawford. As Mabel continued her work, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. The voices grew louder, and she recognized the unmistakable sound of Thomas's voice. He was one of the school's top students, handsome, with blonde hair and striking blue eyes. He was the son of one of the school's wealthiest donors, a young man who had the world at his feet. Mabel had seen him walk through these halls countless times, but she never expected what was about to happen. Without warning, Thomas shoved Mabel against the wall, knocking her off balance. The force of the push sent her sprawling against the cold, hard surface, and a sharp pain shot through her back. She stumbled slightly but quickly regained her footing, her tired eyes meeting his without flinching. His friends, who had been walking with him, laughed at the scene, the sound echoing down the hall. They found amusement in the way Mabel, an elderly black woman, was treated as a mere object of their amusement. "Do you even know what you're doing here, old woman?" Thomas sneered, a mocking grin on his face. He didn't even wait for an answer before continuing. "This place is cleaner than you are." The words stung, but Mabel kept her composure. She had heard worse in her lifetime. This was not the first time she had been belittled for her race or age, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But something about Thomas's arrogance, his casual cruelty, made her heart tighten. As if to add insult to injury, Thomas deliberately stomped over the freshly mopped floor, dragging his muddy boots across the tiles with a smirk on his face. The dirty footprints left behind were a clear act of defiance, a statement that his world was above the work Mabel did, that her efforts were worthless in his eyes. Mabel paused, looking up at him with tired but steady eyes. Her breath was even, her movements controlled. She had spent years facing disrespect in silence, but today she felt a fire stir in her. She straightened up, the mop in her hands feeling heavier than usual. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What you're doing is wrong, and I will report your behavior." Thomas just shrugged, his arrogance still evident. "Report it all you want," he said dismissively, turning away with a mock wave of his hand. "You're just a janitor. What's anyone going to believe, huh?" He looked back at her, sneering once more. "You don't even know what respect is." Without a second glance, Thomas and his friends walked off, the sound of their laughter fading as they moved down the hallway. Mabel stood still for a moment, her heart racing with the injustice of it all. She had dealt with rude students before, but something about this encounter felt different. He was not just disrespecting her, he was belittling her very existence, as if she were beneath notice. It was then that Mabel noticed a teacher walking down the hallway, having witnessed the entire incident. The teacher, a middle-aged woman, looked between Mabel and Thomas's retreating figure. Without hesitation, the teacher stepped forward, concern on her face. Mabel, are you all right? She asked, her voice full of genuine concern. Mabel nodded, brushing herself off. I'm fine, Miss Davis. Just doing my job. But Miss Davis was not satisfied. She paused, taking a breath before saying, I saw what happened. I'm reporting this. He can't treat you like that, Mabel. Mabel hesitated, then gave a small nod. She appreciated the teacher's concern, but deep down, she knew the road ahead would be difficult. The school was a place where power and wealth spoke louder than anything else. But that didn't mean she wouldn't try to stand up for herself, to show that even someone like Thomas Crawford could not get away with treating others with cruelty. As Miss Davis walked away to file the report, Mabel returned to her work, but now there was a determination in her step. This wasn't just about cleaning the floor anymore. It was about dignity, and Mabel would fight for hers, no matter what it took. After the incident in the hallway, the school principal, Mr. Wright, knew he had to act quickly. Mabel Robinson, a loyal janitor at Redwood Preparatory School for years, had been disrespected by Thomas Crawford, the son of one of the wealthiest donors. But when Principal Wright made the call to Alexander Crawford, he didn't expect the response he received. The morning after the incident, Mr. Wright sat in his office, staring at his phone for a long moment. He knew that the situation would be uncomfortable, but he had no choice. When Alexander Crawford finally answered, his voice was as sharp as a blade. I'm here at the school, Alexander said, with an air of superiority. What's this all about? Principal Wright, trying to keep his tone respectful, explained the incident, how Thomas had shoved Mabel against the wall, mocked her, and stomped over her freshly cleaned floor. Do you think this is an appropriate use of my time? Alexander interrupted, his voice cold. My son? And some janitor? Why am I even dealing with this? You should have handled it internally. The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. Alexander's indifference towards Mabel was apparent from the start. He continued, his irritation growing. Just fire her, right? I don't care what you do. She's nothing. It's not my problem. You can't expect me to waste my time over this. Principal Wright felt a wave of discomfort, but didn't dare protest. He tried to explain that they were looking into the issue, but it was clear that Alexander had no interest in hearing anymore. He did not care to see her or get to know what she looked like. Fire her. I'm done with this conversation. Alexander's words were final, punctuated with a tone that dismissed not only the issue, but Mabel herself. As soon as the line went dead, Principal Wright sighed, rubbing his forehead in frustration. He knew what he had to do, even if it felt wrong. Later that afternoon, the principal called Mabel to his office. She arrived promptly, her worn janitor's uniform still as neat as she could make it. Mabel entered the principal's office with her head held high, though her heart was heavy. She had known for years that her work at the school, though consistent and diligent, would never earn her the respect it deserved. Mabel, please have a seat, Principal Wright said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. His voice was softer now, as though trying to cushion the blow of what he was about to say. Mabel sat, placing her hands in her lap, her eyes steady on him. She had already prepared herself for bad news. She had seen it coming ever since she had reported the incident with Thomas, knowing that as a black woman in a position of service, the odds were stacked against her. I'm sorry, Mabel. Principal Wright began, clearly uncomfortable. This is a difficult situation, but I've been instructed by Mr. Crawford that your employment here is no longer needed. You're being let go effective immediately. The words hit Mabel like a punch to the gut, but her face didn't betray any emotion. She had been fired before, let down by people who didn't see her value. But to be dismissed with no proper reason, just an envelope in her hand and the cold dismissal of her years of hard work. This hurt more than she could express. No explicación, Mabel asked softly, though there was no anger in her voice, only a quiet resignation. Principal Wright shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. I'm afraid I don't have one, Mabel. You'll receive the official notice and your severance. I'm truly sorry it came to this. Mabel nodded slowly, absorbing the words. The quiet humiliation was almost unbearable. She had spent so many years in this school, keeping the halls clean for students who rarely saw her, working hard and quietly with no recognition. But the truth was Mabel had always known her place here, and today she was reminded of it. Her place was at the bottom, easily cast aside when inconvenient. She stood up slowly, the weight of determination notice in her hand like a burden she had to carry. "Thank you, Principal Wright," she said, her voice calm but firm. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of his office. As Mabel stepped into the hallway, she felt a deep sense of loss. Not for the job itself, but for the dignity that had been stripped from her. She had been dismissed as if her years of service meant nothing, cast aside without a second thought. The reality of it settled like a cold weight in her chest. As she walked through the hall she had cleaned so many times, the sound of her shoes echoing in the emptiness, she realized just how alone she truly was. The school that she had given so much to, the students who walked by her every day, had never seen her as anything but a tool. And now, with no job, she would have to start over, with nothing but her resolve to guide her. Mabel's hands were calloused from weeks of scavenging, her fingers stiff and sore from lifting pieces of scrap metal she had gathered from the abandoned lots and alleys around the city. Every piece she found was another step toward survival, a small victory in a life that had taken a harsh turn. She had once taken pride in her work at Redwood Preparatory School, but now, without a job, her life felt like a never-ending struggle. Each morning, she woke up to the same routine, searching for anything she could sell, looking for small odd jobs that could pay a few dollars, just enough to buy a meal for the day. The streets had become her office, the city's forgotten corners her new workplace. The metal scraps she carried were heavy, not just in weight, but in the burden they represented. Her hands, once used to cleaning and serving, now scraped and sorted through the debris of a life she never expected to be living. There was no escape from the cold reality. The days blurred together, each one feeling like the last. But through it all, Mabel never lost her resolve. She kept going, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. On this particular afternoon, she was near a construction site where old metal beams and discarded materials were piled high. She had spent the last few hours there, carefully picking through the debris, when a sleek black car slowly rolled up beside her. The car was out of place in this rundown area, and its polished exterior caught the light of the setting sun in a way that made Mabel pause for a moment. She wiped her hands on her worn pants and straightened up, but before she could make sense of what was happening, the car door opened. A tall man stepped out, wearing a sharp suit that contrasted starkly with the dirt and grime of the area. His face was familiar, but it took Mabel a moment to place him. He was tall, with dark hair, and as he approached, the recognition hit her like a jolt of electricity. "Aunt Mabel," he said softly, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Do you remember me?" Mabel froze. The name was foreign, almost as though it didn't belong to this man standing before her. But then, the memories rushed back in a flash. Memories of a much younger boy, one she had once cradled in her arms. The flash of blue eyes, the tears as she held him close. Mabel's breath caught in her chest. She hadn't seen him in over 2 decades, and yet, here he was, standing before her as a grown man. "Alexander," she finally whispered, the name slipping from her lips, uncertain, but sure enough. Alexander Crawford, once the child she had taken in as her foster son, the child she had cared for as her own. The memory of those days was bittersweet, filled with the warmth of love, but also the pain of choice she had to make. When Alexander was 9, she had let him go, believing it was the only way for him to have a better life, to be raised by a wealthier family that could give him things she could never offer. But that had come at a cost that Mabel had carried silently ever since. "I thought I'd find you here," Alexander continued, his voice laced with an emotion Mabel couldn't quite read. "I've been thinking about you for a long time. I owe you an apology." Mabel shook her head slightly, her heart tightening. "You don't owe me anything, Alexander," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The years of separation, of silence, had made it difficult for her to express the emotions that swirled inside her. "You were just a boy." But Alexander wouldn't let it go. His gaze softened, and he took a small step closer, carefully measuring his words. No, Mabel. You gave me away when I was just a child. You sacrificed everything for me. I don't know what you went through, but I should have been there for you. I've been living with that regret, thinking about how I could have treated you differently. You deserve more than what you've been through. And I should have acknowledged that should have been better. Mabel felt a lump form in her throat. All these years, she had carried the weight of her decision to let him go, believing it was the best thing for him. But now, standing before her as a grown man, it was hard to reconcile the past with the person he had become. She had always told herself that she made the right choice for his future, but seeing him now, with the wealth and success he'd built for himself, she couldn't help but wonder what could have been. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Mabel, Alexander continued. I just want to make it right. I know I can't change the past, but I can offer you something now. I want you to come live with me. I have a home, a place where you can be comfortable, and I can give you the life you deserve. Mabel blinked, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. Live with you, she repeated, almost as if the words were foreign to her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The life she had lived, the endless work, the struggles, the loneliness, had become her reality, her only option. But here, in front of her, was the man who had once been her responsibility, now offering her a place in his world. She hesitated, the weight of the past and her own pride pressing down on her. But Alexander's sincere gaze, his quiet regret, softened her defenses. Maybe, just maybe, this was the opportunity she needed to finally move forward, to leave behind the struggle that had defined her life for so long. I'll come, Mabel said softly, a hesitant nod escaping her lips. But on one condition, I need to make my own way. I won't live as your charity. Alexander's face broke into a small but genuine smile. Of course, he replied. I wouldn't dream of it. And so, Mabel's new chapter began. Not as a servant or a discarded woman, but as someone who finally had the chance to redefine her life with the man she once cared for offering her a second chance. Mabel's first morning in the mansion was cold, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. The house was a sprawling, pristine estate, every corner polished and perfectly curated. It was a far cry from the small, humble apartment she had once known, yet it felt equally foreign. As she walked through the grand hallways, the silence felt suffocating. The high ceilings, gleaming floors, and extravagant decor only seemed to highlight the emptiness of the place. It was a life of luxury, yes, but it felt hollow, emotionally distant, as if the mansion itself was built on an unspoken coldness. Mabel had always kept her distance from wealth. She had worked for the privileged for years, seen their indulgences, but she had never been part of that world. Now, she was living in it, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a cage. The house was stunning, but as Mabel moved through its rooms, it was clear that what mattered most here was appearance, not connection. Alexander, though kind in his words, remained emotionally distant. He had offered her this place to live, but he had never made it clear that he was truly welcoming her into his life. It felt like he was trying to erase the past, to act as though nothing had happened between them. There was no mention of the years they had lost, of the sacrifice Mabel had made. His presence felt like a distant echo, more like a host than a son. But it wasn't just Alexander who made her feel out of place. Thomas, Alexander's son, made it clear from the start that he harbored nothing but resentment for her. He resented her presence in the house, despite the fact that she had cared for his father when he was just a child. His bitterness toward Mabel was palpable, like a shadow hanging over every interaction. Every glance from Thomas was filled with disdain. It didn't take long for the emotional abuse to turn physical. Every task Mabel was given seemed to be an attempt to break her. The first morning, Thomas had given her the unpleasant task of cleaning the dog kennel, a space that reeked of wet fur and dirt. He sneered at her as she scrubbed, making sure to remind her, "You should be grateful to even be here, doing these jobs." That was only the beginning. The basement, dark and musty, became another of Mabel's workspaces. She was assigned to clean the grimy toilet, the one no one else seemed to touch. Every time she entered the basement, she felt the weight of the house pressing in on her, each step heavier than the last. But it wasn't just the work. It was the way she was treated, the way Thomas made sure to remind her of her place. One day, Mabel found herself scrubbing the floors of the kitchen while Thomas lingered by the counter, leaning against it as he sipped from a glass. He looked down at her with a smirk on his face. "You really don't know how to stop, do you?" he taunted, his voice laced with condescension. "I'm sure you're used to this sort of thing, cleaning up after people." Mabel kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the work at hand, not willing to let him see the hurt his words caused. But it was hard to swallow the sting of his insults, hard to ignore the deep ache of betrayal from Alexander's silence. Why had she come here? She thought. She had come to this cold mansion in the hope of a second chance, of a peaceful life, but it seemed like her new reality was no different from her old one, just more polished, more hidden behind doors that locked out warmth. Days stretched into weeks, and the emotional wounds Mabel endured began to wear her down. Despite her best efforts to keep her composure, the constant verbal abuse from Thomas, the resentment from the house, and Alexander's refusal to step in left her exhausted. There was no respite, no sense of belonging in this lavish, isolated world. The silence from Alexander, who had once promised her a better life, was deafening. He remained oblivious to how badly his son's cruelty affected her, never once stepping in to stop Thomas or defend her. Mabel kept to herself as best as she could. She did the work given to her, kept quiet, and held on to the fragile thread of dignity she had left. But inside she was breaking. Every insult, every degrading task felt like another piece of herself was being torn away. The mansion, so grand and cold, felt like a gilded cage. She had sacrificed so much to come here, hoping for peace, for understanding. Instead, she found herself enduring the same disrespect she had faced for years. The house was eerily quiet that afternoon. The air inside the sprawling mansion was thick with tension, as it had been for weeks. Mabel moved about, cleaning the same rooms, tending to the same tasks, all while the cold atmosphere of the house seemed to weigh her down more with each passing day. It was as though she were invisible, a mere shadow in a place that had long ago stopped feeling like a home. It was then that the shrill sound of rollerblades skidding across the hardwood floor broke the silence. Mabel barely had time to turn before Thomas came speeding around the corner of the hallway, his reckless enthusiasm a stark contrast to the stillness of the house. He was skating through the house again, something he had been doing for days, with no concern for the damage or the mess he was causing. "Watch out!" Mabel called out, instinctively moving to the side as he approached, but it was too late. In a sudden movement, Thomas shoved Mabel out of his way. The force of his push caught her off guard, sending her stumbling sideways. Her worn shoes skidded across the slick floor, and before she could even catch her breath, she found herself tumbling backwards. Her hands scrambled for purchase, but there was nothing to grab. With a sickening thud, she collided with the stairs, her frail body crashing down the steps, each one hitting her like a hammer. Thomas froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Mabel's body tumbling down the stairs, followed by the heavy silence that filled the space. Then, a quiet gasp escaped his lips, and he skated to the bottom of the staircase, his eyes wide with horror. Mabel lay there, crumpled at the foot of the stairs, her body twisted unnaturally. Blood began to pool at the base of her forehead, staining the pristine floor beneath her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. Thomas stood motionless, his hands trembling as the realization of what he had just done began to settle in. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline of his earlier recklessness replaced by a wave of panic. For the first time, Thomas felt genuine fear, not of getting into trouble, not of his father's anger, but of the consequences of his actions. "Mabel!" he shouted, his voice cracking, his body frozen in place as he stared at her bleeding form. He bent down, his hands shaking as he reached for her. "Oh my God, what have I done?" The fear and regret that filled his voice were unmistakable. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine remorse. This wasn't just another one of his cruel pranks. This was something far more dangerous. Within moments, the house filled with the chaos of a frantic emergency response. The sound of an ambulance approaching outside pierced the air. Alexander, who had been in his study, rushed to the scene, his heart racing as he saw his son standing over Mabel's body. His eyes flicked from Thomas to Mabel. It took him a moment to comprehend the gravity of the situation. "What happened?" Alexander demanded, his voice rough with panic. Thomas's face was pale, his mouth moving but no words coming out. His body was rigid, still in shock, and it took a few moments for him to finally respond. I pushed her. I didn't mean to, but she fell." His words were frantic, his voice thick with guilt. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Alexander's heart sank. He bent down to check on Mabel, but she was unconscious, the bleeding from her head a clear sign of how severe the fall had been. The color drained from his face as he realized that his son's reckless behavior had led to this. "Get the paramedics in here now," Alexander shouted to the butler, whose face mirrored his own shock. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and Mabel was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, her body limp and unresponsive. Alexander watched as they loaded her into the back of the vehicle, his eyes locked on her battered face. His son, standing behind him, was still in shock, his mind racing with the reality of what he had done. As the paramedics drove off, Alexander stood frozen for a long moment, his emotions a storm of confusion and guilt. How had it come to this? His mind flashed back to all the times he had ignored Mabel's quiet dignity, the times he had allowed his son to torment her without stepping in. The realization of his inaction hit him like a ton of bricks. "Dad," Thomas's voice broke through the silence, his tone shaky, his usual bravado completely gone. "I am sorry. I didn't mean to hurt her." Alexander didn't answer at first. He was too focused on the wave of guilt that had engulfed him. His son had hurt someone who had once cared for him, someone who had given everything for him, even when he didn't deserve it. Finally, Alexander looked at his son, his face hard but with an unmistakable sorrow in his eyes. "You should have never treated her like that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And now, because of your actions, someone is in danger. I don't care what happens to me, but I won't forgive myself if she doesn't make it through this." The words hung heavy in the air as Alexander turned and left the house, heading toward the hospital, his thoughts clouded with guilt and regret. Thomas remained behind, his face pale, the weight of his actions sinking in with each passing second. He had never truly understood the consequences of his cruelty until now. As the door slammed behind Alexander, Thomas finally allowed himself to feel the full depth of his remorse. And in the stillness of the mansion, he was left alone with the terrifying truth. He had pushed someone too far, and now it might be too late to undo the damage. Mabel's eyes fluttered open slowly, the harsh light from the hospital's ceiling making her squint. Her head throbbed with pain, and her limbs felt heavy, as though they were not her own. She blinked a few times, trying to adjust to her surroundings, but the sterile white walls of the hospital room felt alien. She had no memory of how she had gotten there, only the vivid image of falling down the stairs, the sharp pain, and then nothing. Her thoughts were a haze as she tried to gather herself. But then a familiar voice broke through the fog. "Mabel? Mabel, you're awake." It was Alexander's voice. Mabel turned her head slightly, and there he was, sitting in a chair beside her bed. His suit was now replaced with casual clothes, and his once unyielding demeanor seemed softened by something Mabel couldn't quite place. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot, and there was an unmistakable sadness in his expression. Mabel didn't speak at first. She wasn't sure what to say. The years of silence between them had piled up like bricks, and each one seemed heavier than the last. But she could see in his eyes that something had changed. Something was different. "I'm so sorry," Alexander said, his voice shaky. His gaze dropped to his hands, which rested in his lap. "I've failed you, Mabel. I should have done something. I should have stopped Thomas all these years. I should have known." Mabel felt a tightness in her chest, her heart constricting at the vulnerability in his voice. This wasn't the Alexander she remembered, the boy she had once taken care of, the boy she had held in her arms when he was just a baby. This was a man scarred by years of resentment, guilt, and unspoken truths. "You couldn't have known," Mabel said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but strong in its quiet honesty. She paused, her thoughts drifting back to the painful decision she had made all those years ago. "I didn't abandon you out of neglect, Alexander. I did it because I loved you." His head snapped up, confusion and surprise flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward, his voice strained with disbelief. Mabel took a deep breath, her mind wandering back to the past, to the moments she had spent cradling him as a newborn, to the endless nights she had stayed awake, wondering what the future held for them both. "When you were born, things were hard. I was poor, and I couldn't give you what you deserved. I wanted more for you than I could ever give you. And I knew you would never have the life I dreamed for you, unless you were with a family that could provide for you. That's why I made the hardest choice of my life, to give you away." Alexander's face shifted, his jaw tightening, as if he were processing the weight of her words. "I don't understand," he murmured. "They told me you abandoned me for money, that you didn't care about me at all." Mabel closed her eyes briefly, remembering the pain of those days. "They lied to you, Alexander. They told you that because they wanted to take you from me. They wanted to erase everything I did for you, to make you forget me. I had to let you go because it was the only way you could have a chance at something better. A life without hunger, a life where you didn't have to struggle like I did." Her voice cracked, the weight of the years pressing down on her. "I cried every night after I gave you away, but I believed it was the only way I could give you the future you deserved. I loved you too much to see you suffer." Alexander was silent, staring at Mabel as though he was seeing her for the first time. His face softened, and for the first time in many years, Mabel saw the boy she had once known, not the man hardened by years of bitterness and misunderstanding. Slowly, his hand reached out, trembling, and took hers. "I'm sorry, Mabel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years, I hated you. I thought you didn't love me, that you didn't care. I thought you abandoned me." Tears welled up in Mabel's eyes, and she squeezed his hand gently. "I never wanted you to hate me, Alexander. I just wanted you to be happy." He nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. "I see now. I see what you did for me. You didn't abandon me. You loved me enough to let me go. I was wrong, so wrong about everything." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of their shared pain and regret settling between them. But slowly, like the first signs of spring after a long winter, something shifted. The years of hurt and resentment began to dissolve, leaving behind a bond that had once been broken, but could now be rebuilt. "I'm sorry, Mabel," Alexander said again, his voice soft with the sincerity of his apology. "I should have been there for you. I should have protected you when Thomas treated you like that. I was blind to the truth. I failed you." Mabel smiled faintly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "It's never too late, Alexander. I forgive you. I always have." For the first time, Alexander seemed to let go of the heavy weight of guilt that had burdened him for so long. And Mabel, despite the pain of her past, felt a deep sense of peace. "I want to make it right, Mabel," he said, his voice steady now, no longer filled with doubt. "I've spent so many years trying to push away the past, but I've learned that there's nothing more important than the truth. I want to be part of your life again, if you'll let me." Mabel nodded, her heart full. "I've always wanted that too." And as they sat together in the quiet hospital room, a sense of healing washed over them. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a new beginning, a moment of reconciliation that would guide them forward, a second chance at the love and understanding that had once been lost. Mabel returned to the mansion with a heart full of uncertainty. The sprawling estate, which once felt cold and isolating, now held a new meaning for her. It was not just a place of wealth and grandeur. It was a place where she could reclaim the respect and dignity she had always deserved. But as she stepped through the doors, there was a tension in the air, a silent weight that hung between her and the family she had once cared for. Alexander had arranged for a family meeting, calling together the household staff. As Mabel stood beside him, her presence commanding the room, Alexander addressed everyone in a firm, unwavering tone. From this day forward, he began, his voice echoing through the grand dining room. Mabel is no longer just the woman who cleans these floors. She is to be treated with the respect and dignity that every member of this household deserves. Anyone who insults her or disrespects her will be immediately dismissed. Do I make myself clear? The staff shifted uneasily, exchanging glances, but none dared speak against Alexander's words. The power dynamic in the house had shifted, and there was no question that Mabel's place was now elevated. She wasn't just a servant. She was family. After the meeting, Alexander turned to Mabel, his eyes softer than they had been in the past. "I should have done this long ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything. How I allowed this place to make you feel small." Mabel smiled gently, her heart still raw, but her resolve stronger than ever. "It's all right, Alexander," she replied, her voice quiet but full of weight. "We both learned from this." But the healing had only just begun. Later that day, Thomas approached Mabel in the hallway, his usual swagger replaced with a deep sense of regret. He had been avoiding her since the accident, unable to face the woman he had wronged so badly. But now, standing before her, he had no choice but to acknowledge the gravity of his actions. "Mabel," he said, his voice faltering slightly, "I owe you an apology." Mabel's gaze softened as she looked at him, seeing the fear and remorse in his eyes. This wasn't the same arrogant young man who had tormented her for weeks. This was someone who had been deeply shaken by the consequences of his cruelty. "I'm sorry for everything I did," Thomas continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I hurt you. I disrespected you. And I've realized how wrong I was. You didn't deserve any of that." Mabel remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. She had been through so much pain, so much hurt. But now, seeing Thomas in front of her, truly remorseful, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just about him making amends. It was about her own peace. "I forgive you, Thomas," she said softly, her voice steady and calm. "I don't hold any of it against you." For a moment, Thomas stood frozen, unsure if he had heard her correctly. But as her words sank in, a wave of relief washed over him. He had been carrying the guilt of his actions for so long, and to hear her forgiveness was more than he could have ever hoped for. He took a step forward, his arms trembling, and before Mabel could say another word, he pulled her into a tight hug. Mabel's initial shock quickly melted away, and she hugged him back, her arms wrapping around him as they both stood there in the quiet hallway. It was a simple but profound moment, a gesture of healing that had been a long time coming. As they broke apart, Alexander appeared at the end of the hall, watching the scene unfold. His face, once hardened with guilt, was now soft with relief and gratitude. He had witnessed the painful fracture between his son and Mabel, but now he saw the cracks beginning to heal. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that the wounds of the past could be mended, not through grand gestures, but through the small moments of understanding and forgiveness. Alexander walked over to them, his eyes meeting Mabel's. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen him like this, and I've never seen you like this, so strong, so full of grace." Mabel nodded, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Sometimes it takes facing the truth to heal," she said softly. "But healing isn't just for the person who caused the pain. It's for everyone." And as Alexander, Thomas, and Mabel stood there together, in that quiet hallway, they knew that their family was no longer fractured by years of pain and misunderstanding. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a new beginning, a new chapter where forgiveness replaced bitterness and love replaced resentment. The road ahead would still have challenges, but for the first time in many years, Mabel felt like she could breathe. She was no longer a figure dismissed and overlooked, but a woman who had fought for her dignity and earned the respect she deserved. In that moment, Mabel realized that forgiveness was not a gift she gave to others. It was a gift she gave to herself. The story of pain and misunderstanding had come to a close, and in its place was the promise of redemption, healing, and the power of a second chance. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.